This is House Planning Help episode 341. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up, Jae Cotterell from Passivhaus Homes returns to the podcast. We're going to be looking at whether embodied carbon or energy efficiency should be our priority on a new build. And just before we get into our interview, I wanted to mention that Lloyd Alter's book, it looks like it's all set for release now. We interviewed him when he released Living the 1.5 Degree Lifestyle, which was so interesting about the decisions we make and we can make a difference. And this next one is The Story of Upfront Carbon, how a life of just enough offers a way out of the climate crisis. I thought I'd mention that now because it's quite relevant to the conversation that we're going to have. And I'm just going to quote him here. These days, I am apt to say we have now emissions and later emissions. Upfront carbon is released in varying amounts from every building material and product, even wood. That's why how we build is almost as important as what we build it out of. So that sets me up quite nicely for my chat with Jae Cotterell, director of Passivhaus Homes. I've always been impressed with her passion and ethics for the business, but there's a lot of knowledge wrapped up in her build system. So I started by asking Jae for a recap on what the PH15 system is.
So it's a complete solution to build to Passivhaus performance levels, but using low embodied carbon materials. And for us, that is focusing on timber, but not just solid section timber. We're looking at contemporary variations, which use the timber very efficiently. So specifically using a lot of laminated veneered lumber, what's called LVL, and a lot of wood fibre, low carbon insulations as well, because a lot of the passive house, there's a huge amount of it is insulation, of course. So looking at that aspect of it as well. So it's combining the energy efficiency with the embodied carbon, bringing those two things together.
I feel like I know your business quite well because not only have I visited several projects, but we had a case study in the hub where I got to see it all come together, and I think fantastic work. So I'm assuming you're a millionaire now.
I am not, sadly, a millionaire. I don't think that you go into these areas to make a lot of money. You do it out of interest and because you want your work to be meaningful and to contribute in some way. And I hope that we will have done that. I mean, I'm never sure you can over-egg that one, but that's the hope, that you're contributing something positive.
Yeah, well, I think we're all in this boat, and that's perhaps one key part of our community. So let's talk about some of these hurdles for a moment then. Why, when something makes so much sense, and I'm sure this will come out as we go through our topic, but what are some of the barriers that people, they don't follow through and take up this system that you have?
For us, it's the nervousness around timber in the UK. And of course, we are a brick block country. There was a history of some bad detailing of timber some decades ago. And these things live in people's memories, I think. So it's not like the European or Canadian or Australian cultures which really focus on timber. We just don't. And we have a very, very conservative attitude. Our insurance companies are very conservative. I absolutely suspect that some of the big house builders block it because they want to continue building in the way they do, and change is always a big problem. The bigger and bigger you get, the more resistance to change there is. So I think there might be a little bit of industry blocking. So it's just changing that culture, and we need to change it, and we need to learn about timber and how to use it well.
As a self-builder, we can make up our own minds. So I'm just thinking out loud here of obstacles that you might have. What about fire risk, first of all?
That's another interesting one, isn't it? That a lot of the awareness around fire has come from Grenfell, post-Grenfell, which had nothing to do with timber or natural low-embodied carbon. It was all these plastic-based, oil-based insulations that caused the problem there. But the backlash seems to have been on the natural buildings market, which is sort of difficult for us as we're a young industry. And of course, there is a truth as well. Timber does burn, but there are many ways in which to detail it so that it doesn't and that it's incredibly safe. We don't have any voids, for example, in the way that we build. I mean, we've actually tried to burn one of our LVLI joists. Jonathan's done it with a blowtorch, literally blowtorching the end, trying to get it to, and it just, not catching alight. And also there has been, because of the nervousness, there are new products we've seen recently. I was going to make an actual separate little article and a giveaway on new fire-related products for the timber industry. There's membranes now that you can wrap that are very, very fire-resistant. So there's absolutely no reason to be not building mid to low-rise buildings in timber. And there are examples of much higher ones in Europe done in timber as well, probably with CLT, cross-laminated timber, but certainly for the majority of our houses, which are mid to low-rise, there's absolutely no reason we shouldn't be building in timber.
What about structure then? Is that something, Three Little Pigs, we know bricks are good and timber's not bad, but...
I think that probably does sit in our conscious, doesn't it, from our childhood?
Definitely, yeah.
More than you realise. You get to the brick and you think, that you've arrived at the best, when you get to the brick house. I wonder if there's an equivalent story in European countries, or if that is a British story. Now, I don't know.
That is a good question. I will come up with that at the end and answer.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting one.
But there is nothing in, it's still a solid structure at the end of the day and no issues.
Funny enough, I had a builder. We often have builders building our system for the first time, because we don't build ourselves. We train the contractors to erect. And he said, I thought it was rubbish, He said, I didn't tell you, he said, but I thought this was rubbish. And then he started and he said, it's really quite good, isn't it? It's really solid. And I just laughed. So, again, it's this idea that a timber building is going to be flimsy, but actually it's incredibly robust and strong. And we always say we're building for 100 years.
You just have in your mind, because of some of the careful use of timber, that it's going to be wobbly at the end. Or are there noise issues? Is this another one that perhaps people think block work, it's very dense, we're not going to hear through the walls? Is that something that might trouble people?
I've not heard that one so much. And of course with Passivhaus, because you've got the air tightness and you've got all that insulation, it really wouldn't matter which way you built your house. You're going to have a quiet house. Well,
I'm running out of reasons why you wouldn't want to build in timber. Let me just have a quick think if there's anything else. My only other objection might be, is there enough timber to go around?
That's a very good question. There's a mindset that thinks, timber sequesters carbon. We can just use, more we use, the better. Whereas actually timber is a precious resource. So we actually need to be thinking, can we use less of it? And we should be using it for our houses, because the embodied carbon is so much lower than if we go for a brick block passive house. And that carbon, when you're building the house, is going straight into the atmosphere. So it is important, but let's try and find ways and agree ways that we're using it effectively. One way of using timber versus another way of using timber could be up to 60% difference in the volume of timber being used. So that's an enormous saving, how intelligently we go about using timber. And if we want to build a timber industry in the UK, which I really believe we should be doing in Scotland and in Wales especially, then thinking about what we're trying to create and creating more contemporary, clever products that use timber effectively, I think is going to be key to any success.
Our conversation today is really about energy efficiency versus embodied carbon and which is more important given the whole bigger picture. But I'm going to let you set it up as you see fit, and then I'll just chip in as we go along.
Yes, so very recently the Passivhaus conference was on, and someone subsequently was using LinkedIn to make a comment about, well, actually, if you're really concerned about carbon, you should be looking at the materials you use rather than Passivhaus. That's going to be the bigger save. And I thought it was a very interesting reaction. And I did a little calculation on a sort of 100 square metre house, an average sized house. And actually, if you look at the next 20 years, 20, 30 years or so, the initial period of a new house life in terms of embodied carbon is likely to have probably double the impact than the Passivhaus savings will have on the energy efficiency. So it is absolutely true, if you're thinking about pure carbon and you're thinking about these critical next couple of decades, you really need to be thinking about embodied carbon and what your specification for anything you build is. But there are much broader reasons why you would build a passive house, and some of them are quite critical. In particular, peak demand on the grid. So we're going to have problems with the amount of energy, decarbonised energy we have. And Passive House is absolutely fantastic in that way, because it really helps to reduce that peak demand. And it also has other amazing benefits, health benefits particularly for humans and for the health of the building. And so there are a whole range of reasons why you would build a passive house, but purely on carbon terms, you cannot deny the importance of thinking about the materials you build with.
So I suppose that begs the question then, how can we make sure that we are careful what we do? What are the factors that matter?
This is quite a complicated question when you get onto embodied carbon. You know, there's a brilliant programme on Radio 4 called Is It BS? And somebody was asking about their sheets for beds and things. You know, should you have linen? Should you have eucalyptus? Should you have, and there's all these different products and they're eco products, and she was saying, is it BS or should I? And the guy has this fantastic job and he goes off and he researches it for a whole week. And he basically came back and it was BS because it was so complicated how you made the sheet and it had so many variables in it. And by the time you'd extracted, say, from the eucalyptus, you were really only getting cellulose, and cellulose could have come from anything, any tree, really. And then it was about how they made it. And then it was about how long did it last. And it's the same with when you ask me that question, should we be thinking, well, it's quite a difficult question, and maybe that's why we avoid it. But that's why we think systems are good, where you've really done your research. The product has been made responsibly by the manufacturer. It's been sourced. It's long-lasting. It's got high potential for recycling at end of life. All of these things come together into the pack. So it's not a simple answer. Very difficult if you were going to, like this person was asking about their sheets, if you were going to look at every area of your life and try and research, you'd have to give up your job, wouldn't you, almost, to make all these choices. So we do need solutions, I think, like PH15 that can show you, look, it is manufactured responsibly, it is sourced responsibly, it is recyclable, because there's no point getting something that's going to be thrown away very quickly or something that's going to be a problem at end of life.
So going back to this, talking about the upfront carbon emissions, we can't deny that, but what are we saying? Are we saying, first of all, should we be building? Should we be more sufficient? Like you said, all of these juggling factors, or should we just build what we like because it's too difficult to think about it all?
I'm a big fan of the Climate Change Committee. The government makes commitments, and they're the advisory group to say how those should be realised. And actually, if you look at what they write, it's extremely sensible. And their particular writings on housing, and new housing, says we should build with timber wherever feasible. So I have no doubt about that either. The question whether we should build at all, some people would say we should be building minimally and only what we absolutely need. And I think that's probably correct. Not probably. It's difficult for a company like ours because you're a commercial company, and if someone wants to build a 300 square metre house, do you refuse to build it for them? Or do you build it and think, well, at least it's being built with a far smaller footprint than if you didn't build it? It's quite an ethical conundrum at this point. It's a very messy set of circumstances.
And your entire business is set up on trying to do the right thing at the very beginning. This is one thing I said to you when you arrived, you've already done the work when you set up on day one. That's one of the biggest challenges.
Yes, but the challenges go on. We've talked about it in-house and said, well, what do we do, And I think, well, we do need new housing. I think that's true. So what we're just trying to shift we're working towards trying to do more affordable social housing. And we will continue probably to do some very large private houses at the same time. And it's not ideal, but it's part of the mess the decisions you make.
Now, why do you like social housing then? What's the reason for that?
Well, I suppose I feel the disparity between the have-nots and the haves is so big, and having a high-quality home that also has low bills and energy and is also very healthy, those are massive benefits to someone who is under pressure. Also, that the impacts of climate change always affect the people at the bottom of the pile more than the wealthy. So the wealthiest 10%, 5% cause the problems, and the bottom end of the people under financial stress and strain end up paying the biggest price. So I think it makes sense to focus on doing something high quality. And I love the idea that our social housing terraces that we're just being built, called Hook Hollow, they are made in the same way as our high-end houses are. It's the same thing, it's the same performance.
And I bet you that the local authority will have also been looking to simplicity, which sometimes self-builders are not so good at. So maybe you could explain why that can be quite a good thing too.
Yes. So talking about efficiencies, one of the efficiencies is just to have a very good form factor. So that is the shape of the home versus the delivered floor area. And very good form factor house might be, for example, a terrace. Probably one of our biggest houses has got a form factor, a non-social housing private house, of over 4. I think it was 4.4. And then our best, which is a social housing project for Lambeth, I think it had a form factor of 1.8. So basically the price of the 4.41 versus the 1, it would have been double for the same performance outcomes. And that's because you're doubling the amount of material. You're doubling the amount of stuff.
The heat loss area. So it's bigger. You've got more to build.
Yeah, double. You've got a lot more envelope, a lot more stuff being required. So, and if you go to the affordable housing, you need to really think on price and be challenged on it. And this year we've been thinking we're going to build up a sort of portfolio of concept designs that people can lift. And the first one we've done is 5 houses in a terrace in the most compact form, but also aesthetically attractive. In fact, we're sitting looking at it almost, and I think you agreed it was a very attractive looking compact terrace concept. But behind it is this idea, let's really optimise in every way. Not only are we optimising the material, the amount of material we're using, but we're also optimising the shape. So we're doing it on many, many different levels. And of course, passive house in itself is an optimisation, isn't it, for energy efficiency? That's the whole concept.
So let's look at your system then in terms of the actual materials. What do you mean by you've optimised it so you're using the minimum amount?
Royal Institute of British Architects was asking for, it was a couple of years ago I think, ideas around the use of timber, because everyone's recognising that we do need to, for climate change, look at timber a bit more. And we put a submission in, and what we were saying is ways of making timber can vary enormously, as I've already mentioned, between the types of product. So initially, say, you build a house out of solid section timber. So you literally stick build the house, versus you use something like we use, which is a laminated veneered lumber in an I-joist format. You compare those two things, same house, you compare those things in terms of the raw material, you can use 35 to 50% more of the log when you do the LVL product, when you make the LVL versus the solid section. So basically you waste a lot of the log in the solid section. So that's an enormous saving in itself. Then as you move on, there are different contemporary products. One of them, cross-laminated timber, which is sort of a mass timber product almost, versus LVL, laminated veneered. I did on a modest-sized house, there was a 44% more timber. So I was doing it building to passive house. I'm building my passive house and I'm using a CLT product, versus I'm building my passive house, I'm using an I-joist product. It was a 44% difference in the amount of timber going into that building. Now, I could turn that into a positive, and I could make a claim and say I'm sequestering 44% more carbon in that building. And I'd say that was a very false dichotomy. That is not a positive that you should be boasting about. What you're really doing is wastefully using a lot of timber. So, this thing of sequestering carbon is a bit of a grey area. And yes, it is true you're sequestering carbon and it has some benefit, but you have to be very careful about that, because really it's the amount of timber we have. We don't have loads of timber. And if we're going to use more of it, we really need to think about the whole circular. We need to think about our forests, planting. It takes a long time. If you using so many trees in your house, how long does it take for those trees to actually bring that carbon back from the atmosphere? I think you're looking at decades and you're looking at 30, 40 years maybe.
And you've also got to think about the biodiversity of these areas, because they only plant, I think I'm right in saying, 4 or 5 different species in a lot of the forests in Scotland. That must have an impact on the biodiversity.
It has a massive degradation on that. Now, I know with Scotland, they've had a big problem with these mono forests in the past, which have really reduced the wildlife and had an effect on biodiversity. But I was listening in to the Welsh Government talking about their plans for Wales, and Wood Knowledge Wales are inputting into that. They're a great group of people. And they're saying their new forests have, as I understand it, they're starting to plant over 50 different types in these new types of forests. So they're really thinking right from the start how to do this much better. But it will take time, and it takes people to get involved. I mean, the timber industry would be a great industry to get involved with at this point in time, just like agriculture is, because we need to do it so much better. And people understand that now. So hopefully in the future we'll be having more biodiverse sources for our wood, and not these monoculture sort of dead spaces that were happening in the past.
You mentioned those types of timber a little while ago. Do they have their purposes though? So you'd obviously want to use the smallest quantity of timber, but if we're doing 3 stories or 4 stories or something like that, is that where cross-laminated timber comes into its own?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's horses for courses, isn't it? I'm not demonising anything particularly, but it's using common sense, isn't it? You don't need to use it for a low-rise terrace. But if you're going to do a block of flats, for example, in an urban setting, it may be absolutely the right product. Scotland has one factory, high technology, I think, just one, that's producing CLT now. They've managed to work out how to use because the UK timber is different from European timber, because it's growing faster, because we're wetter, we're more temperate climate. So there's a bit of, again, can we make some of these products in the UK with the wood? Because it's not exactly the same wood that you're getting in Europe. So at the moment, nobody's making laminated veneered lumber in the UK, because it is a higher grade, stronger timber. I mean, Wood Knowledge Wales certainly think that it would be a possible thing to do, but it needs looking into. It needs prioritising. Can we make some of these higher grade products in the UK and get a more sophisticated timber industry emerging? And I think that's a very big thing we need to be looking at.
Just looking at our reference point where we started all this again, about going down the natural materials route, because that's going to have the immediate effect, because we're using all that right at the beginning. So what about this argument of perhaps building a lesser standard home, still good, but out of very sustainable materials?
My problem with that is, where does that stop? What are you talking about? Passive house brings so many benefits that are critical. If you omit, and this is what is likely to happen, sadly, is that the 2025 supposedly net zero housing standard will end up dropping triple glazing, for example, and dropping air tightness. Actually, the U values of the walls and the roof and the floor might be incredibly similar to passive house. But if you drop triple glazing, and if you drop ventilation with heat recovery, you double your energy demand. Double it. Those two things alone are incredibly significant in the energy efficiency. And on top of that, they are the things that give you that constant temperature. They are the things that ensure you have high indoor air quality. They are the things that ensure you don't get mould. They are the things that ensure you get this very low energy demand that helps us with peak demand on the grid. So you drop the standard and you drop a whole load, a basket of benefits just get thrown away. And I think it will be an absolute error to not actually do it properly and go for it and make sure we have MVHR, make sure we have the triple glazing, and make sure we really do address fuel poverty, the health issues.
I live in a passive house that is a masonry cavity wall build, and part of that was just this is the main way that construction still builds, and I wanted to learn about it. But I'm not so sure if I were building a passive house again that it would be the approach that I'd pick. I think there are better ways, and your system, for example, addresses that straight away. But what do we say then to the people that might be building with concrete, for example, ICF? They're still building a passive house.
Well, it's back to what we were saying, isn't it? The embodied carbon element and the cost. I think it's just not what we should be doing. And some of the methods of decarbonising concrete, like using substitute fly ash or something like that, there's only so much of that product. It won't cover the amount of concrete it's not an answer, really. It's just an answer for a small proportion of people. So, unfortunately, you have to use concrete in the ground often, so you've got to use some of it. I mean, I would like to see a lot more houses built out of the ground with timber shell cassettes in the floor, but that means you have to probably pull the house out of the ground by over 0.5 metre. There are ways to get more concrete out of our buildings, but I think we have to be careful about greenwashing of some of these products. And net zero, for example, is one of the most mismarketed greenwash phrases currently. There's so many claims being made. This is why it makes it complicated, doesn't it? So many claims. I found an advert for oil, all green with flowers growing around it. They're presenting it as a no carbon or something on it, and I couldn't even get my mind around how that could even be said. But it happens all the time. I just do not buy into people saying polystyrene and concrete is low embodied carbon. It just frankly isn't.
I thought you might say that. Let's have a quick think about the grid then, and why going passive house makes a lot of sense and going all electric.
Yeah, so there are plans for decarbonising the grid. Sometimes people think there aren't any, but you can actually find them, and the government has them, and there's different routes to decarbonising the grid, and there's an optimum route, for example. They're called future energy scenarios, I think, and if you look at them, they actually show how much offshore wind we'll need, how much solar we'll need, how much nuclear we'll need. And you look at it and you think, my goodness, the ambition. The amount of these sorts of new energy systems we need to get to 2050 is remarkable. And that is only going to produce a proportion of the amount of energy we're using now. So demand reduction is a big part of it. So passive house is what comes in there, this energy efficiency to reduce the peak demand. And also all of that energy that's going to be produced and be distributed on the grid is electric energy. So our houses need to match electric energy use. And the only way to do that is to reduce the demand down. So in our passive houses that we do, we've committed to this No More Gas campaign so that we will not put gas in any of our new houses. And that's how it should be. They should all be electric. And that gives you opportunities as well to have really simple heating systems, low maintenance, low cost solutions actually, which is what we say should happen. Let's get the fabric really high quality, have a very simple hot water and heating solution. And think I mentioned to this on this social housing project we're just finishing, there are no heat pumps, full heat pump air source heat. So you're saving a lot of money in technology, lots of maintenance, lots of replacement costs are being saved, and instead you're investing in the passive house idea, fabric first, getting that really good. And that's a real help to the landlords, who then have a very low maintenance housing solution going forward, because they hold on to those buildings for decades and decades. They don't want to be messing about trying to repair complicated renewable energy systems. And then it's also good for the grid.
Is there anything else we should add to this conversation then of embodied carbon and energy efficiency?
Well, I like the whole idea of keeping things smaller but high quality. And if our culture could move towards valuing quality and longevity rather than hugeness, I think if there was a sort of almost an aspirational aspect of that grew up, that people would show off as much about the thing that they've done that's high quality. But people seem to go the other way. I come across people all the time, they're not willing to compromise on size, but they're very willing to compromise on quality. And we need that flipping as a culture, don't we? We need to not be willing to compromise on quality, but being willing to compromise on size. I'd love to see that change, because I think it would make a big, big difference and be much better for us, a much more insightful and wiser way of viewing things.
It reminds me, quite often I'll have even friends who are doing projects and I just struggle to get through to them in terms of why this all stacks up and why it makes sense. I think of my chat with Mark Brinkley, author of the House Builder's Bible, saying that he still feels a lot of people don't get it, the real value in coming into a warm home, of good ventilation where you haven't got damp and mold, constant temperature. And I must admit, I don't really know how we get that through to people. If I'm talking about friends, but you must have had the same challenges. That's why you're not the millionaire yet.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the opposite. The truth is, something like a wood burner, which is in the cultural psyche, and people will fight for their wood burner, to have their wood burner in their house, because they've experienced it somehow and got it in their minds. It's a really lovely thing, a must-have. But the passive house comfort or indoor air quality and low bills is something that's not yet in our cultural psyche, is it? So you hope as more and more are built, that will shift. But again, it takes time, doesn't it? But it's so lovely to be in a passive house with the indoor air quality and the comfort. It should be in the hottest day of the year and the coldest day of the year that both of those are true. And yet it's like people don't sort of understand it, do they? They don't grasp it, and they're quite willing to throw it out with the bathwater.
And maybe finally, if we return to the Passive House conference, this guy was stimulating debate, but was the Passive House concept something that he grasped after going to the conference?
I think he was very willing to accept the other advantages of Passive House, I think. And I think he was maybe just calling out the bluff,
Right.
And I think that was quite a valid thing to do. And, I quite enjoyed reading that challenge. We should be willing to be challenged, shouldn't we? And I think when we did the Passive House handbook many, many years ago now, the only thing that the Passive House Institute didn't really warm to was we had a chapter on, can you build a passive house with natural materials? And I was puzzled at the time, and I thought, it's because they really, really did not want to restrict, to make any comment. They wanted to be absolutely, what's the word?
Material agnostic.
That's it, material agnostic. And yet my feelings about it, that you shouldn't be material agnostic, have just grown and grown and grown, over the years, until it's almost a little bit of a problem, because you can see passive houses being built with extremely high embodied carbon materials, and Also, if you do the calculation of a really big house, let's say a 300 square metre, 400 square metre house, and you compare that to a non-passive house, ordinary house, that passive house will be using more energy purely by the floor area. So you can have your bragging rights that you've built your passive house, but it's so big, you're using more energy than the modest person in their 80, 90 square metre house. And we shouldn't avoid saying that.
I think we've touched on a lot of really important themes today. So I just want to say, Jae, thank you very much.
Thank you for having the chat with me, and I hope people enjoy it.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/341. You can review the main information in our summary. Also take a look at that scheme that we talked about, the Hook Hollow social housing scheme. Let's hope there's lots more of social housing to come with PH15. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, you can head into the show notes or onto social media. We'll give you the links to that. We'll link you to Passivhaus Homes, to the Passivhaus store, houseplanninghelp.com/341. And I did look into the Little Pig story and where it came from. It was the UK. I think it started to gain traction in print form in about 1840-ish, and then it was later in the century that it was popularised, I suppose you could say, but all from England to begin with. So there you go. Cultural baggage that we haven't shaken off just yet, but there's hope. It may be the end of the podcast, but there's lots more to dig into in the Hub, our membership community. And one of the key things is networking with like-minded individuals. Until you've been through a project, you may not realise that it can get quite stressful, you can get really busy, and not everyone understands those stresses and sympathises with you. So that's one thing we can do in the Hub. You can also have a chat with me if you want to in the office hours. And of course, we've got all the learning resources too, the courses, the live training with guest experts. You can chat to Ez on Ask the Expert. We've got our in-depth video case studies. And the whole goal of it really is to just make life a little bit easier on our self-builds or retrofits. So if you want to find out more, head to houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, architect Kirsty Maguire is my guest, and we're going to be looking at reusing materials. How do you actually go about doing this? And we're going to use a case study where a building was demolished, but demolished very carefully. So I suppose that's going to be a key step. But this was an award-winning project at her practice, and the project's called The Seed. So we'll find out more about that next time. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.